On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Anthony Girolamo. He is the VP of Engineering and Product at Flex. We're going to cover a few different things on this episode. Anthony's worked at some really big companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and we're going to talk about how you translate some of that experience to startup. And he's at a fantastic startup right now. We're going to talk about things that you need to potentially put in place as you're growing fast and what you can bring from some of those large company experiences, touching on some of those process and growth type initiatives that everyone's always trying to put in place. They're fast growing Series C startup, and excited to cover these topics. Anthony, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, Mary, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to it today. So as you said, I currently lead product and engineering at Flex. Flex is a leader in the on-demand warehousing space. So we provide flexible, elastic capacity to companies looking to ship products by creating a two-sided marketplace where we connect those shippers with warehouse partners across the country. And we do that through our technology platform, which is my core responsibility. So glad to be here today.
Awesome. So I guess to set context, I know I mentioned briefly you've worked at some big companies and now you're at Flex, which is a fast growing startup. Let's maybe kind of just set the stage at the top, maybe talk a little bit about, what you did in Amazon and Microsoft. And that way we kind of pivot into what's going on at Flex now.
Yeah, perfect. So I've had a kind of interesting career, always in engineering, knew I wanted to be an engineer from a very young age, tinkering on computers when I was a kid. Out of college, I went to Microsoft as an engineer, where I worked inside of a core security group for a number of years early in my career, then moved on to the digital rights management space, so encrypting video. Great experience, learned how to really rigorously engineer systems, and then moved on to Amazon, where I was introduced to supply chain logistics and was an engineering leader for almost 9 years. Spent 4 of those years building a system to predict what people will buy on Amazon.com and all of its properties. And then spent the last 5 years helping to build systems which enable Amazon to understand where all of its physical goods are and how they're being processed. That kind of culminated in me eventually deciding it was a great time to join a smaller company where I ended up at Flex.
Awesome. So I talked to a lot of people who are at bigger companies and always are a little bit hesitant to move just to a non-public entity, a smaller organization. I guess just from your standpoint, when you're looking to leave some of the security of the Amazons and the Microsofts of the world to go to a company like Flex, what's the decision-making process like? What was it like for you, at least?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something I've been talking to people about recently as we hire a lot. So when people join smaller companies, I think there's a big trade-off that you're making, right? Definitely at a larger corporation, there's a lot of security. There's a lot of ability to have massively scalable impact. But things can frankly just take a little bit longer because there's so many different use cases and people involved in getting that done. And so I think one of the things that attracted me to a small company was the ability to move very fast again and to get really quick feedback from my customers, even if it wasn't quite at the scale I was used to operating at. So one of the things I talk to folks about is what excites you? Is it the speed at which you can deliver things, or is it the scale of what you deliver? Because I think they're both very interesting problems. They're just very, very different depending on the company.
I guess when you're looking at making that transition and you spend obviously a decent amount of time between Amazon and Microsoft before joining Flex, you lose some of the established processes. As you mentioned, things take a little bit longer. You start at Flex and all of a sudden you're realizing speed is of the essence, fast growing startup, get ideas out. For you personally, what were some of the mindset shifts that you had to kind of undergo to hit the ground running, or was it pretty natural and just fell into place for you?
I think it was the first week to me was really a little bit of shock and awe. I think coming from big companies, really simple questions like, hey, is there a directory for all of the people in the company and who they report to? Or, hey, where can I find all of our source code? And there must be one place where I can get access to everything. Those are actually really hard questions to answer at Flex. And so I think what I missed immediately was how much infrastructure you just take for granted at these larger companies and how long they've had to really actually make it very, very usable and very functional. And so what you give up is that ability to have all those things. And on the flip side, it's actually really invigorating to be able to create those things from scratch. And so, simple questions like, hey, how do we want our continuous deployment pipeline to work? What should it operate like? You get the opportunity to build that from the ground up and very quickly, which is, for me, has been really invigorating. And I think it's folks that have found their ways to smaller companies or startups from the larger companies, I think all have had the same experience.
So I guess, when you put it that way, obviously There's, big companies, there's decisions already made, there's frameworks in place, there's guardrails, for lack of a better term. There's ideas that are already entrenched. So, things to shift would be expensive, to adjust, to pivot, all those things. It's just a bigger ship to move around. When you're kind of looking at your difference in experience at Flex, and all of a sudden, as the VP of engineering, you're brought in to help establish some of those things. How much of what you did before translates over versus having to be careful not to bring too much? Because obviously, like you said, all the names for the company and a director even could be a challenge.
Yeah. So, one thing that I have definitely taken forward from my time at Amazon is this idea of one-way doors and two-way doors, right? Which is most decisions are actually really easy to reverse, even on the engineering side. And so, one thing I always ask myself is, what is the worst thing that could happen with this decision? If it's a deployment, we could take out the entire system and all of our customers could be impacted, as well as how reversible it is. And so for us, we've started to build quickly processes, checklists, right, that we ask people to run through to say, like, hey, what is the worst thing that could happen when we deploy this code? And if the answer is it's not that important or it's not that risky, go ahead and do it without much more thought. If it could have a big impact, hey, let's just take a second and talk about it. And so that was one kind of key idea early on in my career, which is not all decisions are the same or the same size. And so it's easy to go ahead and reverse those. The flip side of that is that you take for granted how much people have been indoctrinated into certain engineering processes, code reviews, for example, or testing expectations. And, a big aha for me coming to, and this is good advice, I think, going to any company or changing any company, but especially going to a startup, is you just have to check your expectations, which is, hey, when we say something's done, what exactly does that mean? Did somebody code review it? Like, did we have a set of acceptance criterias? What were those acceptance criterias? What do we mean by acceptance criterias? So simply just slowing down a little bit and asking and being curious about what some of those steps are folks are going through has been a big learning for me through this process.
Interesting. I guess as you're kind of sitting there and getting acclimated to, assimilated to the environment, you're starting to see the lay of the land. Are you starting to make mental notes of, okay, these are things we can improve, but not yet. And these are things that would be great to, file away as a maybe potential 2 to 4 years down the road. I guess this is a question when you originally started. Were you starting to take notes of those things?
Totally. And it's one of the things I've been working on, which is this idea of patience, which is, especially when I've changed jobs, you build something and you make it better over a number of years and you change to something else, you typically start that craft again. And so one thing I'm reminding myself is, Rome wasn't built in a day and it takes time to improve things. And so, yeah, looking at, we're talking to a principal engineer of ours today about our operational processes, which are very, very good and very strong, but certainly could be improved. And so we were talking about how fast do we go? And hey, his analogy was we're at like level 4. And I think people are treating us or wanting to behave like we're at level 10, and there's a big gap. And so I think as a leader, being really cognizant of where you want to be versus where you are, and what are the small steps you can take on a regular basis to get you to where you want to be, right? And so it's kind of building that discipline over time and getting a little bit better every day. The other analogy I use is like weightlifting. You don't set a goal to lift 400 pounds and then go into the gym and do that. That's a great way to like hurt yourself very badly, right? You go into the gym and say, I'm going to lift the bar the first day. And then in a week, you're going to put 5 pounds on it. And another week, you're going to put 5 pounds on it. And over the course of years, you suddenly look back and you're like, wow, that was really light. And it's the kind of engineering discipline and engineering processes are the exact same way. It's about adding little bits over time and getting really good at them leads to great results in the long run.
Yeah, I guess that's a great analogy because I think coming in, you could easily start comparing it to an Amazon, a Microsoft, a Netflix, and be a little frustrated why things aren't there and having to go back and building it from scratch. But I guess if you're going to join a startup, I mean, hopefully you realize that's going to go with the territory, that there will be things that are just not as mature yet in the process, depending on, what you're responsible for.
Also, I wish I had had that wisdom and maturity when I first joined. And actually, by my second week, my boss, who is a good friend of mine and someone I worked with for years, he's like, "Hey, Anthony, I love everything you're doing. Turn it down to 70%." And that was a trigger to me. I mean, it was both a funny conversation, but a trigger to me to say, I do need to slow down and I do need to reset my expectations. And that's what started me really exploring, kind of and thinking through like I took all this infrastructure and all this previous work for granted, and none of that exists here. And we need to build it, which was a big aha for me. And then also just really helped unleash a ton of excitement, right? Because it's like, wow, it is a completely open canvas to go draw however I want.
I guess two questions from that. One is open canvas. So when you're there, obviously previously lots of decisions made, as we mentioned, large organizations, change is not necessarily the quickest, easiest thing. When you're approaching it and you're like, well, I do have the open canvas and now I have many options to decide from. Like, what was your mindset to start whittling that down or at least getting more focused and going, well, these are the core problems. I need to potentially identify solutions to these before anything else happens?
So for me, right, the first thing I did, and it's kind of a skill I learned at Amazon, and it's I think a super important skill is like, who are my customers, right? Who are my customers, and how do I impact them? And that's both my external customers and internal customers, right? And that's everyone from the people who pay to use our product to the partners I work with at the company to the people that work on the team, right? All of those are our customers, and so how do they feel about where things are at and being really humble that these are all super smart people who have worked really, really hard to build what we have today and figuring out what pain points they have. Second thing is for me personally, just as an ethos, it's kind of this idea of keep your house in order, right? Which as a software engineer and as a software leader or technology leader, your house has to be in order, which means if your operations aren't in order, right? Just the way you tick and tie and develop software isn't in order. Nothing else good can come from that. And so those are the two things I focus on right away in a new role and the areas of focus in this role right now. And from that, you find a lot of really interesting things, right? As you start going deep with people and asking questions and get curious about the problems that they have, interesting things happen. And so, for example, I was talking to our engineers and they were saying, man, it's just so hard to get software out. I'm like, how could it be hard to get software out? We're a small company, we move fast, we don't have a continuous deployment pipeline. What do you mean we don't have a continuous deployment pipeline? This is, 2020. And so just in the process of doing that, you uncover a lot of opportunity to go innovate with people.
I guess from your perspective, you mentioned obviously you're keeping notes of what you could do. Are you maintaining like an actual technical roadmap where it's like, your own personal, or maybe you share it with other people, I don't know, of what you see unfolding over the next 2 to 5 years?
I like to think about it in two different ways. I have my own little mental notepad. And so this is actually like a little notepad I keep on my desk with a top 3 list of things that I think we should be improving as both a product and technology platform, as well as just inside of the organization. I'm a big believer, though, and as a technology leader, it shouldn't be your plan; it should be the organization's plan, the team's plan. And so, we do have as a team and as an organization, we do publish a roadmap both for our features and trying to get that ironed out. And then we will be working on a technology roadmap which supports that. Which is okay. Now that we want to build all this product, how are we going to go do that? Is Kubernetes the right system for us? Do we need to be upgrading to a different cloud provider? Is our disaster recovery approach correct? I'd like to say we're going to get there soon at Flex. We're still building that discipline.
I guess when it comes to, an item on that list, potentially, whether you go to Kubernetes, what cloud provider, how much time, I guess, are you spending to determine, flesh out those ideas? I mean, how much time do you think you should allocate to something like that?
Yeah. And so, personally, I don't get to write as much code as I would like to more, and as an organization, right? Like what I tell my engineers and what I tell all of my leaders is, we're engineers, right? Which is, and we're here to innovate, we're here to create. And so part of the creation process is messy. And so if we are always feeling like we're so strapped for time that we just have to do the simple thing or the thing we know how to do, we're doing something wrong. And I don't think there's any exact heuristic to say like, hey, set aside 5 hours a day to do innovation. But on a week by week basis, if as a team or as a leader, you can't look back and say like, okay, there's 1 or 2 things that I thought were innovative my team did, that's a signal or a smell that like, maybe you need to go look at how much time are they allocating to that and start poking at like, hey, are your sprints fully loaded? Hey, do you do things like hackathons? And so, what I tend to do is I look back over 2-week periods and 1-month periods and I say, hey, like, what innovation have we created? And if the answer is we just delivered features, that's a good signal that I should go have a conversation with my managers and senior engineers and understand what's going on.
Absolutely. And I guess as you're kind of going through your establishing building process, and I think it's kind of interesting this in your last statement, you kind of start talking about is how much process do you start overlaying on top, right? The last thing you want to do is slow things down, but then there's some things that you need to make yourselves actually more efficient. And it doesn't certainly seem like that's a science. Sometimes it seems like that might be more art than science.
Totally. I think like process or mechanisms or guardrails, right? I think they're really just systems to help people be more effective or to help, do things the way that they know they should be doing them in repeatable ways, right? And I think the danger is when you have process that why the process is there is not defined, right? Or people don't understand what they're doing it for, right? Or the process isn't flexible to what the people or the business needs. So as I think about process, I really look at like, well, what's the problem I'm trying to solve? Is it my team or our ability to deploy software is slowing down or the quality's not high? Or is it people don't know who to talk to get decisions made? Or is it, for example, our interview scheduling process recently we had no process before. We just schedule interviews because there weren't as many. And now as we scaled that up, we realized we got feedback from our engineers. Hey, I've got interviews that are creating checkerboards on my calendar and I can't find any time to code. Well, we were able to apply a simple process there. We say, hey, we're just going to put all of our interviews in certain blocks of time and engineers can sign up for them. And so super simple process, right? Which solves the problem of consolidating and making it more predictable for engineers. And so I think a good process solves an acute problem and everybody knows what that process is trying to solve. And so if the problem comes back, you can say, okay, great. We need to solve a problem, not keep a process in place.
Yeah, it's funny is that I think a lot of times, a good process solves an acute problem and that acute problem gets handled, but that process doesn't go away. And the next time problem happens, the next process kind of built on whatever was there that necessarily isn't relevant, shouldn't even be there.
Well, I think one thing, again, kind of drawing on my Amazon experience, every document there is caveated with this idea, unless you know better, right? And so I think, as a leader, one thing I preach to my teams is like, it's really important to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So it's great that we have a process. It's great that it makes life easy, but don't get lazy. Understand what we're trying to do. And if you realize that what we're doing doesn't help solve that, raise a red flag, do something better, innovate, create, change it, right? Simplify it, make it go away. And I think building that ethos in an organization where it's like no sacred cows and everything is questionable is really important. And over time, that, in my experience, has caused a lot of bad processes or processes that have run their course to get replaced or deprecated with better things.
Absolutely. And I think these are some awesome insights because I think a lot of people do have thoughts of going to startups. And sometimes, especially as an engineering leader, they look at it and they're kind of curious what it's going to be like. And I think some of what you talked about really is a different opportunity. It's solving a different problem of, like you said, speed versus scale. But I think certainly in your case, you guys have your hands full of Flex and you got a lot to change with, I guess.
Well, I think the hope, right, whenever you join a startup is that you trade your scale for speed, but you'll get them both back in the future, right? And that's the exciting part of the ride.
Absolutely. I appreciate you coming on. I think this is great content. I think it's going to be super useful for people who might be thinking about making the decision. If somebody wants to reach out to kind of talk about, pick your brain on anything you mentioned on the podcast, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. Would love to connect with people and talk with them. Always happy and excited to connect with new folks.
Awesome. Anthony, thanks for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. Have a great one.
Absolutely. That's the end of the episode. Appreciate everyone listening. Always ask for two things. One is message me on LinkedIn with any topic ideas. I've got a list and a tally. I'm trying to always find guests to match up and have them come address. The other is share the podcast. I know it's organically been growing and you guys are sharing it. So I can't thank you enough, but hopefully if it helps somebody out, love to see the audience grow even more. Until next time, thank you very much.